Welcome back to OpenLine. We have just watched portions of a powerful documentary, No Girl's Dream, about human trafficking here in Tennessee. Margie Quinn, from a special agent in charge of the TBI, was in that documentary. It was put together by You Have the Power. We have the executive director, Kathy Gurley, with us. So much to talk about in that powerful, and those segments that we saw. When you look at some of the people that were behind it, T-Rex, there was the Taylor Bray. They are pimps, right? Essentially, that's what they are.
Yes.
And they're different kinds. I mean, this is a different way of looking at that whole issue, right?
Right, it is. I think traditionally and historically we've called them pimps. We're calling them traffickers now because that's what they are. I mean, they're peddling flesh and they're getting profit from it, from the misery of others. There are several different types. We sort of categorize them as guerrilla pimps. That's what T-Rex was. He was a very violent pimp, controlled women through brute force and torture. There's the Romeo pimp who romances his victims in. That's the lure for them. There are also pimps who control women through drug addiction by the withholding of drugs. If you're addicted to heroin, as so many Tennesseans are these days, if you don't get heroin within about 12 hours of your last dose, you're going to be terribly, terribly sick. And then there are some that actually have children with these women, and then that's the ultimate hold over them. We've had women tell us that, you know, if they don't make a certain amount of money, or they don't do what the pimp tells them to, or the trafficker tells them to, they don't get to see their child that weekend. And so that then becomes the ultimate hold and control mechanism for these traffickers over these women. But it's something, there's some sort of control.
Do you feel like we are doing a good job of getting the person controlling this? We hear that prostitutes are often arrested, and you know, you go after them, but you watch this and it's clear they're victims. So we're arresting prostitutes, but are we doing a good enough job getting those that are behind it?
We now have strong enough laws in Tennessee that are going to impact that, as we saw with the Kromeyer case. And they're just now getting their teeth around it. That's one of the great things, is Tennessee has actually been very proactive legislatively in putting their hands around this problem.
And there are 4 agents at TBI, right? I mean, that's a major allotment there for this issue.
It is. We were very, very fortunate to get 4 new special agents at the TBI. They began on July 1st. The General Assembly has been very active in this particular area, in the area of human trafficking. And they not only gave us 4 agents, but they gave us original jurisdiction, which means we can go out and investigate crimes of human trafficking. And it provided that the TBI is now going to deliver a minimum of 2 hours to all law enforcement across the state in the next 18 months. So that means that all law enforcement will have better education, better awareness, better training on how to identify a victim of human trafficking. It's very important that we identify human trafficking the first time they hit the system, when they're 13 years old, not when they're 22 years old. It just becomes harder and harder to try to restore that victim to any semblance of a normal life. To the extent that that's possible, the longer that they're in this sort of slavery.
And when you look at Taylor Bray, that's an example of someone who was a victim and then became a trafficker.
That's correct.
And you said that's not uncommon. That happens fairly often. At
some point they cross the line. So if they're lured in at a very young age, at 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, and they're in it long enough, yes, they're going to become perpetrators. They're going to recruit other girls into trafficking. They're going to end up trafficking girls themselves. Again, this is just about the money. But if you have, and the girls that we were talking to at TBI over the last 6 months, they tell the same story over and over again, and it's the story that you just heard on this video. It's early childhood sexual abuse, usually starts in the home. Some are trafficked by their parents or guardians first. They leave home because it's a terrible situation at home, and they end up in the hands of some sort of other trafficker. I mean, it really is the same story over and over and over again. So we've got to be in a position, I think, as first responders, to identify these kids early and put them on a different path.
And you're quoted in there, you say, within, what, 43 hours of a runaway incident.
Within 48 hours. There's a great study, and the acronym is called NISMART. It's the National Incident Studies for Missing, Abducted, Runaways, and Throwaways. It's the most quoted study in the world regarding the commercial sexual exploitation of children. And that's where that statistic comes from. It's 1 in 3 children are approached for the purposes of commercial sexual exploitation within 48 hours of a run incident. So when you put that statistic against the numbers of runaway kids in our state, that's 1,400 kids at risk for trafficking just by virtue of being a runaway. So that doesn't include any other risk factor like early childhood sexual abuse, drug addiction, poverty, any of those other drivers that we consider to be you know, a real mechanism to put them on the wrong path.
And that's why this training that the TBI is going to do for all of the police forces that throughout our state is so key, because a lot of times it looks like something different. It looks like a child who's acting out. Why is she running away so often? And there's a way of interviewing them and handling them that is different for them. And obviously trust is a hard thing to come by from somebody who's gone through this. So this training, I think, is going to be key to these first responders.
Another thing that stands out when you watch the video, the documentary we just saw, is the guy getting his tie tied, and the fact that it wasn't his first time being arrested for this, and it's so disturbing what they're talking about there. But can you talk a little bit, I guess, about his case or in general cases like that? I mean, what can we learn from him? Well,
his case is up on appeal, so we don't want to say too much about it.
Well, then what, yeah, generally.
But, you know, what's out there is that he called a woman on Backpage. Backpage.com is the #1 purveyor of sex advertising in the United States today. The geography of trafficking is really that trafficking occurs on .coms and .nets, not on streets and roads and avenues anymore. So he goes to Backpage and he finds what he thinks is a prostitute, and he calls her, and ultimately he asks her to find him a younger child. We've just seen that in the national news media with Jared Fogle.
That's the subway guy.
That's exactly what he did. Is he purchased sex from women who he thought were prostitutes, and then he would ask them to procure for him a younger girl. And according to the news reports, obviously he was you know, working his way down younger and younger. But that's a fairly common technique, is that you purchase sex from an adult who you think to be prostitute, and then you look for younger and younger girls.
So are we doing enough? Are the laws tough enough to go after that person, the John, or the person who's you know, paying for this and keeping it going? You know, do we do a good enough job? You can both. What do you think?
I think Tennessee's laws are very, very strong, and they're, like I said, they just went into effect, I think, 2013 or 2014. So we're really just now seeing the result of it. As the Kohlmeyer case that you were talking about was the first one that went through the court system under that law. And again, with more training, the DAs and the police officers will be able to pursue those. So I do think we have the laws. We just need to get the implementation going.
How optimistic are you with those laws? I guess, how do you get at this? I mean, I guess there's several avenues. One would be those Johns that are out there paying for this. One would be the terrible, broken, disastrous situation that many of these people come from. You know, there are two ways to go at it. The parent, in some cases, has failed, many cases, and then this predator who's out there, you know, paying for this. I mean, so how do you go at it?
Well, I think you're exactly right. You can't really talk about this problem without talking about demand, because this is a demand-driven crime. This is a supply and demand issue. Unlike many other crimes, this is all about demand. So under the current state statute as well as the federal statutes, we can charge Johns with trafficking, which are now A and B felonies. And I think this is particularly applicable when the person is a minor. So in the case of Michael Kohlmeyer, he was charged with criminal attempted sex trafficking of a child under the age of 15, which is a Class A felony, which is the highest felony that you can have in our state. So I think it's important to understand that we can charge Johns in this state under the trafficking statute. So this is no longer a misdemeanor crime for them if they buy.
So it's important for Johns to understand that
this is not a misdemeanor crime anymore. This is not John's school and then expunged from your record. If you purchase a minor for sex, you could be charged with a Class A or Class B felony, which means you're going to go to prison for a good long time.
And that is, it's fairly new,
Yes.
but that, you think that's getting out there? We're going to start enforcing it that way, and that's actually going to start happening?
I think so. Michael Kohlmeyer was the first case in the state of Tennessee where we charged a John as a buyer under the trafficking statute. But there's some really good federal appellate court law upholding the fact that these statutes do apply to the Johns. We hope that the convictions will stand on Michael Kohlmeyer, but he will not be the last John we charge with sex trafficking, especially when it involves a minor. But I think that gets to another question, which is how we get at this problem. And that's one of the things that the TBI, I think, is going to work on through our training, is as we change the focus of our enforcement, that we worry less about the women involved in this particular crime, and we worry more about the buyers and the sellers. Because that's really, I think, there's much more culpability on that side, the buyers and sellers, than there are on the women in prostitution and trafficking. When
you hear the stories of these survivors, yeah, you do feel that way.
It's gut-wrenching to listen to them tell their stories. Even if they're independent and they proclaim to be independent, they still have this backstory of early childhood sexual abuse that is just, it's horrible to listen to. Even if they're not trafficking victims, many of these women are still coming from this early childhood sexual abuse, neglect, abandonment. What got them to where they are is a really, really sad story. This is not a choice for them.
And you said in the video, it's part of this is changing people's understanding and the perception. And you threw out there Pretty Woman, which, you know, everybody's seen that movie, and you know, great movie, whatever. But it's changing our thinking about this, our understanding of it.
Changing the focus.
And the focus, yeah.
As Margie says, more to the John and the pimp, as opposed to the woman.
The woman, right. And do you think, how far do we have to go to do that?
We've got a long way. This is really a paradigm shift that we're seeing. It's not dissimilar from what we saw 30 years ago with domestic violence. It's not dissimilar from what we went through a couple of decades ago with drunk driving. You know, if we didn't have MAD in our lives today, where would we be with drunk driving? If we didn't have the YWCA, where would we be with the issue of domestic violence? So we're seeing a real paradigm shift right now, I think, not only in law enforcement, but within our societies, as to, you know, what we think about prostitution and trafficking. And I was asked recently by a reporter if prostitution and trafficking were the same thing, and they are not. We're not saying that there's no such thing as prostitution. There is, but we are saying that as first responders, we've got to know the difference, and we've got to be able to determine the difference by some good investigative strategies and tools.
If there is prostitution, there's a likelihood, at the very least, that there's something going on behind it.
Yes.
Right. Okay, we're going to take a break. If you want to call, there's the number 615-737+, 615-737-7587. We'll take a break and be back right after this.